Glad you know what time to be here today. You were probably swimming in time if you were anything like me. Say you get an extra hour of sleep. I just got to get up at an hour, what's newer, earlier time, at least how my body works anymore. But I am glad that you're here. So we are talking about the Psalms and how this ancient liturgical offering by the people of Israel into their own lives of worship, but picked up through millennia, literally by us, and continuing to this day, offers a way of interacting with God and having a conversation with God that is too often not how we go about our conversations with God. What I mean by that is even though we want to bring God all of our troubles and those sorts of things, if we're not careful, some of the deeper and darker recesses of our souls and our existence and how we're feeling and going about the world, we kind of leave that out. At least for public consumption and worship, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, who really wants to kind of revel in that? I ask you how you are, you say I'm fine, even if your life is coming apart at the seams, and that's because who wants to go with Debbie Downer? I mean, literally, Saturday Night Live made a character about this woman who was constantly turning everything into a negative event, and nobody wanted to hang around that sort of person. But that is sometimes where we just are, right? I mean, you show up and you're just halfway there. I mean, you're just barely hanging on. Other times you show up and you're full of joy and just, your relationship with God couldn't be closer. But other times you say prayers, and as the image of so many people I've heard through the years have told me, like it sounds like, or it feels like, that your prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling, and they're just not going anywhere. And the thing about the people of Israel is they put all of this into their psalter, their hymns. They would bring this before God. So we are this morning going to talk about Psalms of disorientation, and we'll get to what that means in just a moment. But we're going to start with a classic, terrible psalm of disorientation in just a minute to get us going. I will set the context for this. The most impactful negative event in the ancient story of Israel is the Babylonian captivity of the people, the destruction of the temple when the Babylonian Empire in 587 BC came in, took over the southern kingdom of Judah, destroyed the temple, and sent into exile for generations a group of, basically how Babylon would work, they decapitated the political and cultural elite by taking them in captivity to Babylon. And so this event of losing the temple is kind of to them like if all of a sudden we lost kind of the National Cathedral and the Supreme Court and the White House and the Congress all at once. And it just kind of, it's this very destabilizing sort of thing. Also, for ancient peoples, they would say, well, our God is great and good and more powerful. I mean, just look that we're thriving. And you're going to see in this psalm what this does theologically to them and how they're mocked by the Babylonians and the sort of anger and rage that takes heart in their very souls. They also, as you can imagine, when you are a conquered people and how, probably don't have to tell you how terribly you're going to be treated, you're going to see them wanting to enact that same revenge upon their people. So we're going to read this responsively by whole verse, and no matter where we end, you're not going to say the last sentence because we're not going to say it communally. And if you want to hear a deeper dive into this psalm, you can go back to one of my sermons about 3 weeks ago where I preached on this very psalm. So we're going to get going with a classic psalm of disorientation. And I'll start. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of those songs of Zion. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day of Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. And happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against rocks. All right, so the Psalms, just by way of quick introduction for anyone wasn't here, or a reminder for those who were, they are the most reliable theological, pastoral, and liturgical resource in the biblical tradition. They're a dialogue of sorts, expressing both sides of a conversation between the people of God, the faithful people, or those struggling to be faithful, in moments like we just saw in that psalm, and God. And it's an honest conversation, as you just read. They articulate the entire gamut of Israel's speech to God, from profound praise and trust to utterance of unspeakable anger and doubt, again, like we just read. And in this literature, the community of faith meets to speak to and hear from God in its depth of need and heights of celebration. And in so doing, they draw our entire life under the reign of God. They say that God is so big and all-powerful that we can trust this God actually with everything. That there's no part of our life, all of humanity, all of human life, all of the corners that we want to hide from one another, you can't hide them from God. And so they let it out, and they say that God is an active part of their existence, and thus must be a part of even their worship life, which is incredible. And so Walter Brueggemann, who we'll hear from in just a moment, this great Old Testament professor that was so impactful on me, he gave this helpful kind of blueprint for mapping the Psalms. It's imperfect, just so to speak, but it does allow us kind of a way to see how the different Psalms interact. There are Psalms of orientation, and these are for times in human lives when everything's just going right. And it's like, I go to church and God blesses me. I know all the blessings of God and nothing, bad happens. But if you do wrong, well, then wrong happens to you. And Trey, would you just help them real quick and make sure they're okay? And, in this sort of easy negotiation with the ways of God, that just life seems right and all the equations add up. And I gave that little, kind of made up psalm of Eric at the gym, and it's like if you go to the gym, then your blood pressure's okay. And if you don't go to the gym but go to McDonald's, then, you need a new belt and, you're going to have problems and all that sort of stuff. And all of that does work. I mean, there's truth in it, right? This is how we teach our kids. You do right, good things happen. You do wrong, bad things happen. But going to the gym doesn't mean that you're not going to get cancer. It doesn't mean that, that you're not going to get in a car wreck on the way home or some violence attend your life out of somewhere. And so the Psalms of orientation make sense until they don't make sense. And then we have, which we're going to deal with today, Psalms of disorientation. And this is because human life consists in anguish, seasons of hurt and alienation, suffering and death. These times evoke resentment, self-pity, rage, and even hatred, as we again just saw. Psalms of disorientation speak vividly to those feelings and offer them to God. They permit the honesty of true complaint with its abrasiveness and hyperbole at times. And then we're going to next week talk about new orientation, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that because we're coming to it, and it's when you move past orientation and you've gone into disorientation and you're in a new place with God. The pain was real. You can't ignore it. It's not going away, but somehow, as much as you don't totally get it or get God all the time, you partner with God in a new sort of relationship. And I would even suggest that this is a kind of a mature sort of relationship. And for Christians, the most profound example of new orientation is the resurrection. But for the resurrection to mean anything, there's got to be a death. There's Good Friday to get to the resurrection, because resurrection doesn't mean resurrection if death doesn't mean death. And so for these ancient people, it works kind of like that. Good Friday's real, but somehow you're in a new place with God, and we'll talk about that next week. It's a good place to get to. Today's not so cheery. But these moves from orientation, disorientation, new orientation, they're not like once and for all. This happens with all of us as we walk through our lifetime of faith with God in various seasons. And we probably know this, times that it just seems easy to be, to show up with God and before God, and then other times you just really wrestle with where's God anywhere in the hurt and the pain in the world that is so fragmented and lost. And then sometimes that you go, I have this strange truce, but I have peace with God. It's like if you saw Forrest Gump. It's like, Lieutenant Dan after the hurricane, when he's up there and he makes his peace finally after the hurricane with God. I mean, that's a good way to put new orientation. And so yesterday's new orientation can become today's disorientation, and this cycle, goes about. And I talked about this image of, in the ancient story of Jacob wrestling with the stranger, that last week, that this ancient story in Genesis, Jacob is this it's a negative name that means usurper or heel grabber. And he gets in this match the night before he's going to finally meet up with his brother who he's wronged, and God only knows what's going to happen. It's like his past is catching up with him. And Jacob all of a sudden is jumped by this stranger, and they wrestle throughout the night, and Jacob comes out of it limping. You can see him, the stranger grabbing his leg, and he's going to hurt him. And the stranger wants to know Jacob's name. Jacob doesn't want to say his name because that gives away his identity. He's a usurper. That's all he's ever been and is. And Jacob demands to be blessed by this stranger. And in the morning, we find out that he's wrestling with this angel, representative of God, or God's self. And so his name is changed, meaning Jacob's name is changed. And the name, everybody know the name that Jacob's name is changed to? Israel. So this is how Jacob's usurpers become Israel, the people of God. And the people of Israel never forgot that they were in a wrestling match with God, just like Jacob, and like we're allowed to be as well. So we're going to do Psalms of disorientation. I told you I'd tell a personal story about this and why these things mean so much to me. Some of this is very familiar to you all, that I grew up with a dad who was a career pilot in the Navy, and it's time that like Top Gun was out, so this was kind of a cool job to have your dad actually doing that little job, and then retired to fly for Federal Express. I always wanted to do nothing else except be a pilot. Started flying airplanes at age 15, and that's why I stayed in Memphis to go to Memphis State, because the Naval Air Station in Memphis was right there, and basically I went to school on the side and flew airplanes for most of the time, and finally got a lifelong dream of being accepted to go to pilot training with the Air Force. And not long after that, I was on a beach with a girlfriend celebrating this great event, his girlfriend Shelly Henderson, who's now Shelly Henderson Long, and I knew somehow in a moment, and I can't describe it anything other than that I had this overwhelming sense that I was not to be a pilot, that I was going to do something different with God. And I've got to say, I didn't really like that. I wrestled with that for some months before I finally gave that up, and ended up, because I was raised in the Church of the Nazarene, Shelly and I moving. I was 21 years old, 2 weeks after graduating college rather, and felt like it. And we ended up in the frozen tundra of Kansas City, where we knew no one and everything else, and very quickly realized the Church of the Nazarene and that level of fundamentalism, even though I was raised in it, that the deeper I went into theological studies and really immersed myself into thinking that would be my entire life, not just what I did, kind of as my church, but what I would do with every day of my life. I knew it wasn't where I belonged, and yet I gave this thing up. At the same time, Shelly's dad died of cancer at the age of 50. And then my parents' marriage started breaking up at the same time. And I was angry and distraught and disillusioned Fundamentalism like that, by the way, is very fragile. It has great bombast, it shouts everything has to be exactly this way, but it does that because it's fragile. And what I mean by that is if everything has to be error-free or whatever, once you see an error, like within Scripture or something, you see something doesn't line up exactly right, well, you can't unsee it. Like, for instance, that, the triumphant entry happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the last week of Jesus' life, whereas in the Gospel of John, it happens right at the beginning of his ministry. You can't put them together. And yet, little things like that become capable of breaking your faith apart, especially when your entire life is up for grabs and nothing seems stable. And at this time, somewhere in here, I was taking an Old Testament course, and Barugamon, and you can go ahead and get that ready, was talking about lament and all these sorts of things that you would never do because you're supposed to always be happy before God, and if anything went wrong, well, it's your fault, and it was just to be blunt, some infidelity in my parents' marriage that was causing this, and everybody's like, oh, well, you just got to forgive that and just act like it didn't. And I was enraged by the entire situation and angry that I had given up this thing and just wanted to tell God basically where to go, just to be honest. Shelley and I quit going to church, which is weird for a seminarian family. We didn't know where we belonged. There's good news, by the way. There's a new orientation. We can get to that next week, and it's called All Saints Episcopal Church. How's that for an All Saints Sunday? But the other thing that I came across was this honest way of offering this to God. And the crazy thing was I found out a God who not only was there, even in my rage and disappointment, but listened and responded and allowed it. That was big enough to remain a conversation partner with an angry young seminarian. So this is Walter Brueggemann on lament.
Almost 1/3 of the 150 Psalms are laments, complaints, protests. That's a lot. And for most of the church, Anglicans probably are a little bit different, but not much. For most of the church, the only psalm of disorientation that we use is Psalm 22 because we can't avoid it because Jesus quoted it on the cross. So it does come up in the lectionary and in the liturgy, but we, by and large, are free to neglect those others. So what we do is to deny the rhetoric of the church, the language of disorientation. And as I said last night, I believe that blanking out that third of the book of Psalms invites people to great guilt, so if something's wrong, it's my fault. Or it invites people to great denial that I have to keep pretending it's working when in fact it is not working. So what I want to suggest is that what the Psalms of disorientation do is to lift up and call attention to the reality of human loss and human pain without making moral judgments about it, about whose fault it is. It is simply a given of human life that needs to be processed theologically. And these Psalms, it seems to me, are so important because they are models of the way in which ancient Israel and then the church learns to have faith in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss, and learns to worship and pray in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss. When I went to seminary, the most interesting teachers I had were in Old Testament.
Okay. So let me see if I can't find. Here we are again. Okay. So That's a little bit of an introduction. You can see a little bit of him. I'm going to quote him at some length here, okay? So Psalms of Disorientation. Now a hymnody, the hymns we sing in church, right? That's what he's saying. So the problem with a hymnody that only focuses on equilibrium, coherence, and symmetry, as in the Psalms of Orientation, is that they may deceive and cover up. Life is not like that. Life is also savagely marked by incoherence, a loss of balance, and unrelieved asymmetry. In our time, that needs no argument or documentation. And he wrote that about 30 years ago. Does it need it in our day and age? No, it absolutely does not. It is a curious fact that the church has, by and large, continued to sing songs of orientation, I would say only orientation at times, in a world increasingly experienced as disoriented. And such a denial is an odd inclination for passionate Bible users, given the large number of psalms that are songs of lament, protest, and complaint about the incoherence that is experienced in the world. At least it is clear that a church goes on singing happy songs in the face of raw reality is doing something very different than what the Bible itself does. So what he's saying, which is exactly true, is that, have you ever heard the term, you have a canon within the canon of Scripture? You have your part of the Bible that we all concentrate on. And too often in our worshiping communities, if we're not careful, our canon within the canon is excising these parts because we don't know what to do with them because they're ugly. Because they sound like that psalm, and we go, well, I don't like that violence, and I don't like, somebody having that sort of rage in their heart, and how dare them, and how could that even be anything that, people of faith would ever feel. The issue isn't that, the scandal isn't that it's in the Bible, the scandal is it's in the human heart, and if they aren't going to process that, as he puts it, theologically and in their community of faith, then it is going to get legs and do something far worse. And by actually allowing it to be a part of their conversation with God, much like my history of that period of disorientation and alienation, basically everybody around me was saying the way to be, a Christian at that moment was to stay in line, forgive. God's right there. You're just not seeing it. Just show up. You're not being faithful enough, and that's why it's all happening, and you're not knowing where God is in the mix, and all that sort of stuff. And I went, no. I hadn't done anything. I've gave up all this stuff, and our entire lives are wrong. And what was happening there was, I knew the Bible, as you could imagine, being very, very religious in that sort of a tradition, but I only know certain parts of the Bible. We didn't go memorizing for Sunday school, as you could imagine, that song. And so all of a sudden, when you explore the totality of the Bible, you find that this is part and parcel of their story, the story of the people of Israel. And I say here, it's because maybe of our affluence, and what I mean by that is there's nothing wrong with being affluent, but it's just that we have tons of choices. Think you can do whatever you want. Well, I hope you're eating lunch here, but tomorrow for lunch, you could have 1,000,000 choices because of this. And because of that, we too often live under the illusion that our world is manageable and controllable, and that works until it doesn't work, right? Because of living in the society in which we do, having everything at our fingertips that we have, because of the great benefits of our lives for which I celebrate and certainly don't want to give up, but that, if we're not careful, makes us think that we're totally in control when a world about us is spinning out of control. And that lasts about as long until it just wills fall apart because, again, a diagnosis or a relationship that you desperately want to have go well, a marriage dissolves, a child breaks your heart, whatever it is. The things that happen in our lives when we realize we're not at all in control. We may believe with enough power or knowledge or money or social standing that we can tame that terror and eliminate the darkness, but a religion of orientation fundamentally operates on that basis, but it's not enough. The remarkable thing about Israel is that it did not banish or deny the darkness from its religious enterprise. It embraces the darkness as the very stuff of new life. Indeed, Israel knows that new life is rooted nowhere else. And what I mean by that in new life is that there is no way to get to where God is taking you except through those trials. Jesus, after his baptism, you are the Son of God. Blessed are you. Listen to him, the voice from heaven says. And immediately Jesus is driven out into the wilderness and suffers great temptation and deprivation. The people of the ancient Hebrew slaves, they're released from slavery across the Red Sea. Now wander around for 40 years until you finally come to the promised land. These seasons are natural to our life, and there's nowhere to get to the destination where God intends us to go except by entering them fully and realistically and honestly with God and one another. It's the only way to new life. Again, resurrection is not resurrection if death is not death. You can't get to Easter Sunday without going through Good Friday. And it just so happens that God is in Good Friday as well, even though you don't feel like it. And Jesus himself cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting the 22nd Psalm. Psalms of disorientation. Perhaps we don't complain or tell God honestly of our dwindling faith at times because we think that's what it means to not have faith. Like if we were more faithful, then we wouldn't feel like that. We wouldn't have those questions. We wouldn't wonder so much. We wouldn't have the anger that I had as a 21-year-old seminarian, and I certainly wrestled with that. Perhaps it's just me. If I just was doing something better than my at least even as the world around me was going to hell in a handbasket, well, I would have peace just within my soul, and there's hymns that sing of that and stuff, so why isn't it happening? And so I would think almost like that's what it means to not have faith. But the Psalms of lament and complaint say that the exact opposite. To trust God as an honest conversation partner is a supreme act of faith. A supreme act of faith. To cry out is not to despair. To cry out is to trust that there may be one out there who hears the cry. And more than just hears that cry, will answer it. It's okay to cry out to God, to show who you are before God, because as we're going to say each Sunday, we don't today because we have baptisms, but every other Sunday, what are we going to say? I mean, who are we kidding? God already knows, Almighty God, to you all hearts are open, all desires known, and from you no secrets are hid. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may then perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name through Christ our Lord. But you can't get to the perfect love and worthily magnifying part without that x-ray of the soul and heart that God already is doing to each and every one of us. And where we are in reality, when we step in here, in every season of the life of the soul, so to speak, is a place where God may act. Even in moments of profound disillusionment and disorientation, even rage like that ancient psalm had. That to cry out, again, is not to despair and just say, well, there's nothing, why cry out? Except that there might just be one who listens, and more than listens, acts. The point to be urged here is this. The use of these psalms of darkness may be judged by the world to be acts of unfaith and failure, but for the trusting community, their use is an act of bold faith, albeit a transformed faith. It is an act of bold faith on the one hand because it insists that the world must be experienced as it really is, and not in some pretended way. On the other hand, it is bold because everything properly belongs in this conversation. To withhold parts of life from this discourse is in fact to withhold parts of life from the sovereignty of God. So I'm going to pause there just for a moment and see if you have any comments or questions. I'm going to have to repeat them because we're recording this, so if you don't mind, let's not have a big speech, because that's going to be hard for me to, to recite back, but I certainly want to hear any questions or comments that you have.
Eric, does the lectionary omit a third of the Psalms?
The question is if the lectionary that we use omits a third of the Psalms. No, except on Sundays. So if you engage in daily prayer and go into the prayer cycles of morning and evening, noonday prayer, all those other uses of Psalms throughout the week, then you are going to encounter all of the Psalms. As you can imagine, on Sundays, you can't do all of that. It's a 3-year cycle so they basically, you kind of hit and miss a little bit more with them. And they're kind of underrepresented given their prominence within the Psalter itself, if that makes sense. They're more prominent within the book of Psalms than show up on Sunday mornings in our church. But they're not absent, because I just preached, 3-4 weeks ago on that terrible psalm of disorientation, Psalm 137. But they're underrepresented. Anybody else? So I want to take a moment, and we're going to listen to Brueggemann again, if I can figure out exactly what Trey did here. Now, he has this thing where he kind of yells on part of this, so don't be too, I've listened to this a couple of times, and I was like, I wish he wouldn't have done that. I don't know what that is, but let's see what happens here.
Fear not what lies ahead.
I guess we have to listen to that.
6 dragons shall stand at your...
Thank God we could skip
The
that.
fifth element that hasn't come up in these Psalms, but I do want to comment on it, and that is the vengeance. One of the objections to these Psalms is that they really want God to get the guys that have done it. So the best case for that I know is in Psalm 58, Psalm 58:6. You can imagine saying this, and then your psychotherapist says, is there anything else you'd like to say? Yes! And he goes again. 58:6, oh God, break the teeth in their mouth. And you could just, in a nice congregation, you can see doing this, and you say, the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Oh God, break the teeth in their mouth. Tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away, like grass that's trodden down. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into the slime, into the untimely birth that never sees the sun. Sooner than your pots can feel the heat of thorns, whether green or blaze, may he be swept away. Now, the word is that Christians ought not to use these Psalms because Christians ought not to feel that way. Agreed. But what do you feel that way? We do have, from time to time, yearnings for vengeance. So the question is, not should we feel that way, the question is, if you feel that way, what are you going to do with it? And I can think of only 3 things you can do with your thirst for vengeance. You can act it out, get a gun. We're seeing that. But people like us wouldn't do that. You can deny it. But what happens when you deny it, it tends to come out somewhere else that you didn't plan on, in your family or somewhere else. The third thing you can do, which is what Freud understood so well, you can give it over to your therapist, you can give it over to God. And I propose that's what they're doing in these Psalms. They're saying, I am being eaten alive by my anger, and I'd like to hand it off to you. Well, parents tend to know about this. Two siblings are playing in the backyard, and one of them hurts the other one, and the problem is that the parent doesn't really know who initiated it. But the one who has a little scratch with a little blood comes into the house, and like a psalmist, must use great hyperbole to get mother's attention that if you don't do something quickly, I'm going to die from this blood. You do get exaggerated speech. And you do a Band-Aid, and you think you've gotten it taken care of, but then he says, what are you gonna do about him? I'll not be happy till you punish him for what he did to me. A wise parent does not say, you can't talk that way about your brother. A wise parent does not say, wait a minute, let me write this down so that I can do it. A wise parent says, why don't you leave that to me? I have heard you, and now you can leave it with me, and I'll decide what needs to be done. I think that's how these Psalms, at their best, work. And the recovery of the thirst for vengeance in the Psalter, it seems to me to be an important project in the life of the church. Otherwise, people, and particularly young people, don't know that we know about that stuff. And we have known about that stuff forever. And we have devised ways of processing it to health.
Those transitions are really abrupt and sideways, all of a sudden in lows. So I hope that that's helpful. I used an image which will kind of close on of creation. And I think that this is helpful to maybe help us work this out. So the creation narrative is that the world left as it is formless and void. It's viewed in the Hebrew language as a waters of chaos, this big cauldron of nothingness and meaninglessness, and it's all swirling about. And in the beginning, the Holy Spirit rushes over these waters of chaotic mess and start creating order and goodness and meaning. And the refrain goes out over and over again. It is good, it is good, it is good. And creation, as God intends it has meaning. And it is good. And it's ordered in a way that sort of meaninglessness and chaos has been tossed to the side. And yet we know the story that we exist in Eden. And I would say that the Psalms of Orientation are kind of like an Eden-like existence. You know, we do good and good things happen. Not so those outside of Eden, where bad things happen when bad things are done. But the chaos, for whatever reason, is something that God, making us partners in this creation, giving us free will, for some reason we have some affinity for that watery mess. And we keep inviting that chaotic muddle back into God's good world, an ordered way of being, and the chaos pours in. It's really, by the way, what the Noah story is about. That God, if in God's mercy, human beings keep inviting the chaos in, and it's almost like God's pushing it away. And all of a sudden, in frustration, it's almost like God says, let them have what they want. And the waters of chaos swarm in and cover it all. But even then, it breaks God's heart, and we get Noah and the family and all this sort of stuff. But we don't live in Eden. We live, as Steinbeck rightly put it, east of Eden. And east of Eden, there is disorientation. There is that times of alienation and loss of control and all the rest. that comes with real life in a very real world. The chaos floods in, the world is disordered, and peace with God is elusive. And I have no idea why it's trying to recount everything I'm saying, but that's kind of neat. It's very wrong, see, to recount everything I'm saying. Life is uncontrollable east of Eden, right? So peace with God is elusive. The world's disordered east of Eden. And yet, as the story goes, God, all of a sudden, even though the man and the woman notice their vulnerability, their nakedness before such a world, what does God do? First of all, but clothe them. And the God that they knew only in Eden, as they're thrust away from that place, they find out that God's out there too. And in our lives of disorientation and hurt and all the things that can touch our very fragile lives and souls, that God's there too. The question is, will we meet God there? And part of the toll, so to speak, for meeting God is something that we too often don't want to do with each other and certainly with God, and that's just be honest. And that's just to give God all of that stuff and say, this is where I am, and I don't get you, and I'm angry about it, and my life is coming undone, and you're not here in any way that I can see. The good people are taking it on the chin, and these evil people are running away with all of the loot and celebrating it all the way down the road. And where are you? This is not what I signed up for when I came into your worshiping community. When I learned Sunday school lessons as a child, they were psalms of orientation. I do good things, and good things happen. I do bad things, bad things. That's not how the world's working, God. And it's time for you to say where you are in this mess. And the crazy thing, from the very first moments that human beings stepped out of Eden and lived where we live our lives, is that they found out that God shows up. And so, we'll leave where we did last week. We live in a world of chaos and good creation. When God began to create the heavens and earth, the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And here we live in this in-between time, and the Christian hope, as I mentioned last week, is that even this disorientation, as honest as we can be, as real as it is, the fact that we have to move through this Good Friday portion of our lives, that it's not the end, that Easter Sunday will come, and ultimately the Christian hope, as we see, is, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And as I'd mentioned last week, and when I talk about this at funerals, as I quote this each time, this isn't because God doesn't want a beach in heaven. What it's saying is the chaos is finally gone. But it's real now, and God's still in it. But the God who sent God's Spirit over the chaos in the beginning hadn't stopped. And so when we are in that chaos and it seems to be overwhelming us and we're going to drown within it, remember the Spirit still comes to people who cry out. So, be honest with God, the gift of the Psalms. Do I have any final questions or comments before we put a bookmark in it and come back next week for Psalms of New Orientation? Yes, Jay.
I haven't read through one, but I've heard it speak kind of more broadly about the Old Testament and applying kind of a similar rubric where you've got like testimony and counter-testimony.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems kind of similar, right? So in parts of the Old Testament, there's a same cause and effect, like in the Torah, and do well and God rewards you. And then you've got Job and Ecclesiastes and what's going on. And I was just wondering your thoughts about how theologically fair it is to apply this kind of orientation, disorientation, new orientation more broadly, like through the Old Testament or even into
So the question is, just so for the recording, that this isn't, that doing right and, doing right and good things happen is replete throughout the Bible, but also other times where that's not the case. And is this a fair, are you asking if this is kind of fair to imprint onto kind of life all over the Bible, outside of the Psalms? Is that what?
Yeah, all over the Bible, and then specifically in the New Testament.
In the New Testament? Well, I think that the New Testament, it's very, very clear that because, and I will pause it here and we can bring this back up, but it's always there. So for instance, I mean, you would have the blind beggar or the people that Jesus is attending to that are dealing with maladies or social ostracism, and because in their these Jewish people have good theology, but they knew that God made the world good. God made the world ordered. Well, if somebody is born blind, that's disordered. And so who's to blame for that? You remember the story where the disciples say, well, who's to blame, him or his parents, that this guy was born blind? And Jesus said, that's stupid, nobody. None of them are to blame for that. We live in a world that's now a stew of good and bad and chaos and good creation is basically. So, I mean, what I would say and what Brueggemann over and over again says is that this is but a lens. You don't want to push it just like the fundamentalism that I talked about. You don't want to make this like this goes on everything, but it's just kind of a helpful. Some of the Psalms don't fit into this, in other words. Some of the Bible doesn't fit into this. But it's kind of a helpful way of thinking through not only the Psalms, but I think a good amount of life. God intends the world good. We live in a good creation. People are immensely good. They also can capable of great evil. And great chaos is in the world. And we're, thinking about the people at Hurricane Melissa. Those people showed up one day just to life, and life was taken from them. And they did nothing wrong. And so, they have a right to cry out to a God. The hope is that we're headed ultimately where God's dragging us all in creation with it is to that ultimate place where the sea, the chaos, is no more. In the meantime, we live east of Eden. And so it's an imperfect to just overly shove it on everything, this kind of blueprint, but I think it is helpful in its own way. We will have to put a bookmark in it for there, and we'll pick it up next week with new orientation, which is a good place to land, and kind of better news. I'm sorry, Amy? We're moving to a new place with God, where we're still east of Eden, but we have a new relationship with God, that we're not just in the depths of despair, but we don't think all, just kind of, I do good, so good happens, and nothing bad could happen. We're beyond that as well. So that's what we'll discuss next week. So see each week, if you've been to church at 8 a.m., have a great week, or come back for the brunch, I hope, at 11:15. If you haven't been to church, we'll see you in just a few minutes. God bless.